Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Landesmann. I'm part in the board of the Schumpeter Society, and there are some other people in the board, in the audience. Probably a few words before we start. The Schumpeter Society has started in the early 90s, basically as a link to support research visits for researchers, scientists from Austria to Harvard, where Schumpeter was active for a long period, between 1932 and 1950, until he died. And these fellowships were available for people also in the spirit of Schumpeter, across all social science disciplines, not only economics. And I think by now about 30 research fellows went across to have such research visits. Apart from that, we have other activities like this one, but also meetings on economic policy, debates, etc. We also support some young women economists in terms of junior Schumpeter prizes, and also give a prize to to senior people. Last time it was the Commissioner for Competition and Digital Technology, Margaret Vestager, who got this prize. Now, today's event is the third of a new activity of the Schumpeter Society. It started 2 years ago, the Schumpeter lecture, with the first speaker was Philippe Dion, a very eminent theorist, more or less, and he was crucially initiating the branch which is now called Neo-Schumpeterian economics, growth theorist, followed by last year by Branko Milanovic, an economist originally from Serbia but working for many years in the US, who involved himself very much into inequality studies. But he gave a talk at that point on 75 years of Schumpeter's oeuvre, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, and had a very interesting critical assessment about Schumpeter's predictions and analysis at the time. So today is another wonderful occasion to follow up this series of lectures by Bart van Ark, who deviates a bit in what he's doing from the other. He's less of a theorist, but an eminent contributor to quantitative economic studies, and I'll talk much more about him when I introduce his lecture. Before that, I want to thank the Austrian National Bank, who is supporting our activities, especially and this one also today, and which is also cooperating in organizing the event. And we start off, unfortunately the governor is abroad at the moment. Normally he's always coming to our events. Governor Holzmann will deliver a short video message as greetings to this meeting. Probably we can project that video message.
Welcome to this year's Schumpeter lecture, organized by the Schumpeter Society of Vienna and hosted by the Österreichische Nationalbank and the newly renovated Kassensaal. My busy schedule and prior travel engagements didn't allow me to be with you in person, which I regret. Today we have the pleasure and honor of welcoming a well-known speaker, Professor Bart van Ark, who will address the major challenges of our time in the context of productivity with a Schumpeterian spirit. Let me first the Schumpeter Society for having organized the lecture and invited such a distinguished keynote speaker. As the title suggests, the Schumpeter Society was named after Joseph Schumpeter, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, whose legacy continues to inform our understanding of key economic phenomena to this very day. Most notably, his work on developing innovation dynamics, its implication for economic growth, and the concept of creative distraction that he coined are more topical now than ever. Schumpeter taught us to see distraction in a new light, arguing that growth is a achieved via new innovations that render previous ones obsolete. In other words, even the destruction of existing firms and jobs is part and parcel of a productive economy. Let me now introduce to you this year's keynote speaker, Professor Bart van Ark, an internationally well-known economist. Just a few milestones of his impressive career. Professor Bart van Ark is Managing Director of the Productivity Institute and Professor at the Productivity Studies at Alliance Manchester Business School. He's an internationally acclaimed economist in the field of international comparative productivity measurement and analysis, innovation and technology, as well as digital transformation. His research has cut across the areas of economic growth, development economics, economic history, as well as international economics and business. From 2008 to 2020, Professor Bart van Ark was chief economist and head of the Economy, Strategy and Finance Center of the Conference Board, a think tank headquarters in New York, where he oversaw the production of widely watched economic indicators and growth forecasts around the globe. Dear Professor Bart van Ark, thank you for delivering the Schumpeter Lecture 2024 with focus on the important topic of productivity and the need for new productivity narrative. Finally, I wish the audience an interesting keynote lecture followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A session. Thank you and good evening.
Okay. So I didn't know what the Governor Holtzmann will speak, but he has taken over anyway what I would have introduced. But just to say also from my side, we are very, very honored and grateful for you to come to us. I think we know Bart, and quite a lot of people in the audience have been working also with Bart over the years. As you know, I was very active in the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, where we were heavily involved in developing the database together with his group in Groningen, the EU CLEMS database, and later on the Wired database, etc. And we all appreciated enormously cooperating with him. Probably just as a bridge to the talk, there is a rather wonderful publication he just produced. He cooperated with Diane Coyle in University of Cambridge to study the productivity problems of the UK economy. It's called The Productivity Agenda, and it's really an example of how a think tank, in a way, is supposed to work, with deeply based in proper quantitative research in all the different chapters, but also written in a very digestible way. I think what probably comes across is that there are certain lines which are directly linking up to sometimes forgotten areas of Schumpeter's analysis. One is that one should take technologies, specific technologies, seriously in terms of their specificity. And I think you're going to talk a bit about currently what are the special features of AI following the digital technologies afterwards. The second point is, as you know, Schumpeter was not just interested in the innovation, the invention and innovation of technology, but in the diffusion. And again, how technology spread across a distribution of different types of companies, different regions, different countries. And these diffusion processes are as important to look at the implications of productivity growth and overall general growth as studying innovation per se. And I think it guides very much his work, his current work with many researchers looking at firm-level databases. The third element which comes across quite strongly and as a link to Schumpeter was the importance of that as technology gets introduced, as organizational structures adapt, they're changing in market structures, in the power positions of companies who control the introduction of technology and who are themselves driven by the diffusion processes which are pushing behind them. And again, a very often neglected element when one discusses the impact of technology, to look at the same time the evolving market structures. And probably thirdly, again, quite important is following up distributional analysis, that what is happening at the top end of the firms, the middle parts of the firms, the bottom end of the firms can be very different, how they approach and how they're affected by the interaction of technology. And of course, this is true across regions, and I think there's a lot of regional analysis in his current research, and we know his current base in the UK is particularly prone for the enormous regional disparities in which they perform. And that, of course, is true at the national level, at the regional level, like the EU as a whole, or at the global level. And we're living in a current geopolitical and geoeconomic context where uneven developments of growth, productivity, technology transfer is a very, very important part of how the global economy is developing. So let me pass on the floor to Bart, and we look very much forward to your speech. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for this really kind introduction also to the governor. And although it's unfortunate he can't be there, I hope that you will be able to tell him something later on about if there's anything interesting that you took away from it that he might find useful and interesting. Thank you for this invitation to the Österreichische Nationalbank and to the Schumpeter Society. I'm incredibly honored to do this, as this lecture is named after Joseph Schumpeter, but also because I'm following in the footsteps of two earlier speakers, Philippe Aghion and Branko Milanovic, two great economists who I have very high respect for. It would be very pretentious of me to say that my work is standing on the shoulders of Joseph Schumpeter. Although, of course, I've read most, if not all of his work, if I could, although he's written probably more than I could have able to manage. But instead, I would say that I'm standing on the shoulders of some people who I think would agree, if they would still be around, and unfortunately neither of the four is around anymore, who would agree that they would have stood on the shoulders of Joseph Schumpeter. First of all, to Angus Madison, who was my mentor and supervisor at the University of Groningen, and who really taught me the art of being an empirical economist and how to work on long-run economic growth. Secondly, Dale Jorgensen at the University of Harvard, who really taught me the mechanics and the art of doing a good growth accounting. And as you referred to earlier, Michael, in our work with some of our friends here in Vienna, we have together worked on the first work and the first version of the EU CLAMPS database, which I will come back to a little later. But also I would like to mention Paul David, who of the four I probably didn't know that well, but I did have the pleasure to spend quite a bit of time with him in an expert group for the European Commission in the early 2000s on knowledge for growth, in which Paul was very influential in his thinking around innovation and basically helping to shape the smart specialization strategy that the European Commission has since adopted. And I've always had huge respect for his work, as well as his thinking around general purpose technologies, which I will come back to. And then last but not least, I'm standing on the shoulder of Nick Crafts, an economic historian in the UK, who really has helped me to understand the relationship between productivity and technology in the longer term. So this talk is really a tribute to all of them, and it will ultimately, to a large extent, feedback to the work that Joseph Schumpeter has been doing. The title of this lecture, How to Not Miss a Productivity Revival Again, I would say the title is not new, neither is the question. The title is not new because I did publish an article, actually two articles in 2018 and 19 that had this title in it. It's a really cool title because it helps you to really understand that productivity is something that comes and goes and it can revive, but it's not a given. It's not something that happens automatically. And that's why this is such a great title. We can make it happen, a productivity revival, but we can also make it not happen if we are not careful, and that will be an important motivation of my talk. The second reason is that the question isn't really new, of course. We've seen technology revolutions, general purpose technologies for a long time, and always has been this question, when is it going to pay off? The steam engine took 80 years before we saw it paid off into productivity growth for the economy as a whole. The electrification of our economies took maybe about 40 years. We think the time has become shorter, although that's not necessarily true, as I will argue. And we may be at a point that we may actually see a somewhat longer period of time before we see the productivity effects of new technologies happening. So are we reliving the so-called solo productivity paradox? You all know this term back in the 1980s, in 87 to be precise, when he said, we see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And he was right. At that time, we did see computers everywhere. We didn't see it in the statistics, partly because we didn't measure them well. And a few years later, we did measure ICT well. We measure software significantly better. But also because it took time for these computers to really translate themselves into productivity growth. So maybe it's just, again, a matter of time before we will see artificial intelligence and other latest digital technologies translate into productivity growth. We've been here before. These Kondrachev cycles, again, a tribute to Kondrachev, but certainly also to Schumpeter, who then translated that into the impact and the role of innovation in this respect. We've seen these ups and downs continuously, so there might just be a pattern or a mechanism here. And also, the productivity paradox itself is not new. This is only going back to the 1950s, but again, we've seen ups and downs, and the questions about why productivity is not responding so quickly to technology is something that has been coming up quite a few times, and certainly in 1987 and in the early 2010s, after the global financial crisis, this question has been asked again and is on the table. So it might just be a repeat of what we've seen before, but we might also perhaps think that it could be different this time. We are living in a time that is extremely complicated. We're in the aftermath of the pandemic and subsequently the supply chain disruptions we've seen, the huge increase in inflation, and we're still perhaps even somewhat in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and still experience some of that. So we have some of these big events that have happened to us over the past 15 years. And then ahead of us, we have some really large transformations. Well, I say ahead of us, but in a way they're already with us. Demographics, particularly aging of our population, climate change, trends towards less globalization or deglobalization, whatever you want to call it, but also the powers of technology, which have creative powers, but also potentially destructive powers. And again, that is certainly true for AI. So we may just see a productivity paradox 2.0, just a repeat of what we've seen before, but it could also be a new type of productivity paradox. And my main argument this evening is that if we don't quite know what it is going to be, but we better make sure that productivity growth is going to contribute to the terms inclusive and sustainable growth, which we'll come back to a little bit later why this is so important, in order to make sure that it is going to pay off for everyone. So that really brings me to my agenda for this evening. I will start with basically talking briefly about why productivity matters. And many of you in the room might say, well, don't waste my time. I know why productivity matters. But many of you are either economists, you're policymakers, you're not sitting here because it's the first time you hear about productivity. But a lot of people out there don't have anything with productivity. We do research at the Productivity Institute, and actually ask people, including business leaders, what I think about productivity. And many of them would say, well, first of all, I don't quite know what it means. And secondly, if I do sort of understand what it means, I'm not quite sure it's a good thing. So what is the narrative that we're telling about productivity? And my argument is that this is not just something about, just some comms people in an organization who have to tell people what productivity is, but we need to have a view and a vision on what it means and why it is important. On top of that, we have this big issue of measurement, and I will spend a little bit of time this evening on the measurement topic, because of course it's coming back big deal into the productive numbers. Can we still believe these numbers? Are they still right? Again, are the statistics getting better and we'll get over this, or do we have bigger problems at hand? I'll then spend some time on why productivity growth has slowed, notably since sort of the middle of the first decade of this century. And we really haven't seen, with some ups and downs during the pandemic, but we really have seen a significant recovery to trend towards the pre-2000 period. And I will focus that on some of the work on growth accounting that was mentioned earlier, that looks at the role of capital, but not just tangible capital, but increasingly we have evidence about the role of intangible capital, which I will define for you a little later. Then we'll get to the question of how do we revive productivity growth, and notably, what can the role of artificial intelligence be? How can it make a difference? And then finally, I'll wrap up with some shorter remarks around why does this have to support inclusive and sustainable growth, and what is the role of productivity policies? And the reason it's short is partly because I won't have the time, but also I think those might be some of the topics where I'm pretty confident that during our panel discussion and the Q&A, this will be coming back. Okay, so why does productivity matter? As I said, it's a popular notion, but it's not always a positive notion. If you go out there, most people out the room here will equate productivity, if they know what it means. They will equate it with something like it's doing more with less, so it's putting more pressure on the system. It's about budget cuts, it's about efficiency drives, it's about more sweat. A lot of people think that productivity is just putting in more hours. A little bit strange given the definition of productivity, but that's what lots of people, if you're a business person, if you ask them, how do we get more productive? They say, the people need to work harder. So, okay, what does that mean? More hours. Okay, not necessarily labor productivity growth, just one of those confusions. People, serious people in unions will say productivity is the end of my job. And they're not entirely wrong about that, as we all know. And we have to be honest in our story about productivity having a sort of worker displacement effect, to say it nicely, but it basically means that some people will lose their job. And we have to think what we do about that. Productivity may be damaging to our environment. Productivity could create stress and burnout. So just some examples, and those are real examples out there on how people think about these issues. We need to have a story here. We need to be able, because we do understand, I think most of you will understand that productivity, notably total factor productivity, which we'll come back to, is the only sustained source of long-term economic growth. We do know that if companies become more productive, they can free up those resources to invest in technology and innovation. We do know that productive firms grow faster. And we know that in the longer term, they tend to create more employment and certainly new employment opportunities for higher skilled people. We know that productive jobs should charge higher wages and make people more innovative. We know that productive people are often, not always, but often more healthier, and that they do often experience a better quality of life. And we do know that productive places are places that tend to produce better outcomes for citizens, for business, and for society. And you can hear me say with some caution, we think that it should, but it doesn't always be the case. And therefore, it's so important that we tell the story in an honest way, that we understand that productivity is one of those big structural transformations that is happening, that there are pros and cons, that there are pluses and minuses that are offsetting each other. And if we can tell that story, I don't think productivity will ever become a leading part of our policy making. So my way about thinking about productivity at the Institute is that we should not just talk about economic productivity. We'll talk about economic productivity a lot tonight because we know a lot about these kind of things. We know how we think about GDP per hour or total factor productivity. But again, businesses think about productivity sometimes in very different ways. They think about value creation. They think about better products and services. They think about better outcomes for their customers. And yes, we sort of know that this translates itself into better productivity growth, but the relationship is not necessarily well understood. And if you talk to local policymakers, they understand that they have limited resources at their hands, and that they know that if they combine these resources better, that they can create better living standards for their people and better outcomes in society. But a joined-up strategy to become more productive with all these resources, there are not that many places that really get their arms around it. So if you think about these other definitions, then to me, productivity ultimately is broader than GDP per hour. It's about how you optimally combine resources that are limited. Virtually all our resources are limited, so we have to make choices. How we combine those to get better outcomes for people, for firms, and for the economy as a whole. Now, that all sounds great, but it doesn't make life easier. It does make life much more difficult if you think about such a broad definition. When we think about the output side, on the right-hand side of this chart, it means that we have to begin to think about, okay, the current measure of GDP that we're using in the national accounts doesn't perhaps work. We will have to expand this measure, and we'll do some of that already by including other other types of intangibles. We have to think better about public sector output and public sector productivity and how we measure these kind of things. That's all still within the boundaries of the national accounts system where we can make these improvements. And luckily, the system of national accounts is making these adjustments very slowly, very conservatively, but we do see some improvements in these statistics. We also have the benefit that the national accounts is an extremely rich system that has a lot more data than just output by industry and employment, but also has data on disposable income, on real expenditure. And these are the sort of measures that can help us to get a little closer to the welfare of a society and to understand a little bit on how the distribution between different groups in society, workers and businesses or different places, if you do regional accounts, do work. So you can, even within the current system of national accounts, get a much richer view on how productivity relates to welfare. Then finally, particularly when we look at this place-based concept, we probably have to go beyond GDP, beyond the national accounts, and think about well-being measures that are related to health and to education and to quality of life and perhaps even to happiness, as some people would argue. And then, of course, we get into a space that is not manageable within the system of national accounts, and we probably move more towards dashboards of broader welfare, but we shouldn't lose the link between with our thinking around what outcomes ultimately are about. On the left-hand side, you see the resources. And of course, when we talk about productivity, we mainly talk about labor and capital, or human capital and manufactured capital. At least we add the skills, and we recognize there are different types of capital, machinery and equipment, so we make some adjustments for that. But if you think about it hard again, it's very easy to understand that in today's economy, knowledge capital or intellectual capital has to be added into the accounts. And again, luckily, to some extent, that's already true. So we're making some progress there. We get to understand that better. But we need to expand this perhaps even further. We need to think about financial capital, which really determines the access to financial resources for companies to make these investments, or go beyond this and think certainly from a community's perspective around social capital or institutional capital. And if you think about an environmental perspective, you may have to think about natural capital. These are extremely complex issues. There's no way that I can take you through all of that tonight. I will just make a very small step in the direction of intangibles. But you can immediately see that we're making our life much more complex if we expand these concepts. But we probably will have to. So there is a lot of work ahead of us. But measurement becomes a problem. And we have to take measurement really serious, because it's not only important that we know what we're doing, but one of the reasons there's so much skepticism about productivity is that most people out there do not believe we can measure this well. And again, I can tell you this from experience, because I now work in this productivity institute and talk to business leaders and inform people all the time. I say, you can't measure this. It's just impossible. I mean, as a service company, we're only producing intangibles. I mean, how are you going to measure this and make this a measure of GDP? So we have to think about how we actually think about the boundaries of output within the system of national accounts, going from narrow to broad GDP, but also going beyond GDP. We have to think about these boundaries of inputs, how we go to intangibles and beyond measured capital. And then we have to think about the deflators, because quite often we forget, and a lot of people out there don't quite understand this, that productivity is a real concept. It's a concept of adjusting nominal growth in your output and into your inputs for the development of prices. So you need to have proper deflators. And these deflators need to reflect quality changes, because sometimes the price goes up because you create more quality, or in the digital economy, the price goes down once you adjust it for quality very rapidly, right? The typical example of the iPhone that costs you the same every time, but every new iPhone you buy is so much better than the previous one that the real price of it, quality adjusted, is declining very rapidly. But beyond ICT, we see these challenges in the public sector. If we want to measure healthcare output in a proper way, we certainly can't continue to say that outputs are measured by inputs. That's what most of the national accounts are still doing. It actually means there's no productivity growth whatsoever. Some national accounts are now moving to measuring part of healthcare output as activities, as actions being undertaken. But even there, we know that heart surgery today is a lot more effective than heart surgery 10 years ago. So again, we need to make very big adjustments in these kind of measures to adjust for quality. And then finally, something I'll talk about today a fair bit because it's important when we talk about technology. When you talk about measurement of productivity, there's always this issue of the timing of your inputs and the timing of your outputs. And some of that is a measurement issue. Because we tend to pick up the inputs pretty quickly, but it takes a while before we are able to measure the output very quickly. So think about the new technology coming around. In first instance, companies are just spending more money on these kind of inputs. And we're measuring that, but we don't yet measure the output of it the way that it's improving our output properly. And this really goes to the so-called productivity J-curve that's been around in the literature and formalized by Erwin Jolson and Rock and Chad Syverson. And this is basically describing what is happening there. And that is that in an early phase when a new technology is coming around, we tend to underestimate statistical productivity compared to the real productivity. Because we're putting a lot of expending on making that technology work, so we actually put in a lot more inputs, but we're not yet picking up the fact that as a result of that, our output is going to improve. So we're understating measured productivity compared to true productivity. But later on, we suddenly are going to pick up these quality improvements. We say, oh, there's a quality improvement, whereas inputs are at that time already at a certain level. So we are overstating the productivity growth at a later point. And this is a real problem, particularly when a new technology comes around, and therefore quite relevant in the discussion that we are going to have here tonight. Which really gets us to the issue that we haven't really discussed in some detail, and that is why productivity actually did slow. And we'll take that a little bit from this concept of tangible and intangible capital and total factor productivity. Again, no time to go through all of this. There's a long history of the productivity slowdown. There's no single explanation. But just let's get some of the headline stories right here. This is a very smoothed picture of productivity growth, just measured as output per hour or output per person, output per hour where possible, for the world economy, and then divided into the United States, other mature economies, and all the other emerging and developing economies. And you see different patterns over time. We see quite a bit of uptick. I think that is important in the 1990s and the early 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. And then we see that, first of all, the United States and the other mature economies started to slow down, as I said, probably around the early 2000s, middle of the decade of the early 2000s. But then after the financial crisis, we also saw a big slowdown happening in most of the emerging markets. Again, this is very smoothed over time. There's huge amounts of fluctuations here. It's just giving you a sort of headline picture. Dirk Pielert and I did a paper just recently where we looked at the G20 experiences over the period of 50 years. And we found that actually of the G19, because the 20th one is the EU, of the 19 countries in the G20, there's only one country that has shown a growing productivity growth trend over the last couple of years, and that's India. And all the other countries are now in a slowdown period. So this is not just an advanced economy phenomenon. It's the global economy showing a slowdown, of course, from high growth rates in these emerging markets, but we do have this bigger issue at hand here. No time today to go into that detail. I'm going to focus very much on the experience in Europe and in the United States. So that's what this chart is showing. This is not showing you growth rates. This is showing you levels of productivity. This is just expressed as GDP per hour. But you can see the same trend, most countries going up, and then you see some leveling off happening since the middle of the first decade of the century. Some countries still doing quite well, including the US and France and Germany. And then there's a middle group, which is sort of the euro area as a whole, and all the UK is sitting there, and then Spain and Italy are slightly lower than that. There's just two things. One thing I want to emphasize here. We tend to focus a lot of time on growth of productivity, and that's important, growth of productivity. It's the dynamic part of innovation and structural change that I already mentioned to you before. But the other part of it is that if you have this slowdown in growth of productivity for the longer term, you get lower levels of productivity. At least you're going to fall behind, because these are just aggregate numbers. You mentioned the UK a little bit earlier, Michael. This is the average for the UK, that red line over there. But there are regions in the UK where the productivity level is much lower than that. You're then at a point where productivity has become so low in its level that it's not easy to get growth going again. It's not like you do an intervention with one or two companies or a little cluster starting up and then the whole thing will start to go again. These places end up in what we call low-level productivity traps. They're sort of in low equilibriums, and you need an interventionist, coordinated policy to get out of that. Keep that in mind, because that's important for the coordinated policy around pro-productivity. That is really important. It's particularly these places that are falling behind that really need this very, very much so. So productivity growth, slowing productivity growth is a problem, but lower levels means that there are places in each of those countries where levels are so low that we can't get out of them unless we do a massive intervention one way or another. Okay, a little bit of growth accounting, not going to go in great detail. Essential growth accounting does is breaking GDP growth up into the contributions of labor and capital, the traditional inputs that we were talking about where possible, adjusted for quality. And then there's a kind of residual that comes out of the measurement that we call total factor productivity. Now the good news, as I mentioned a little earlier, is that system of national accounts do make progress. The growth accounts are based on systems of national accounts. So we do have some intangibles, which I will define in a minute, added to this. But that, of course, has implications for the growth accounting system. And the numbers that I'm going to show you are the latest growth accounting statistics that do take these intangibles into account, which is very helpful. This is a little chart that sort of describes what these intangibles are about. So it's not machinery equipment, it's not the stuff that you can touch, it's the stuff that is not directly visible, but as you can see from the various definitions, it's the stuff of which we know is driving innovation and growth in going forward. And there are roughly three groups: digitized information, innovative property and economic competencies. I'm basing myself here on the work of Corrado, Sickle and Hulton, who've been describing this over the years. Today, we have a big portion of digitized, well, pretty much all the digitized information and innovative property included in the system of national accounts. We're already measuring that. Software, databases, R&D. We're measuring it as an investment. We're depreciating it. We're measuring the service lives that they have through which they are creating productivity. Then there's this second group, it's part of innovative property, but particularly these economic competencies like market research and branding and organizational capital and employer-provided training, which is currently just measured as an expense. So if you measure value added, it basically detracts from value added. Think about this productivity curve. You put stuff in, but it doesn't become part of value added. It actually, in first instance, detracts until you start capitalizing it, and it's going to produce an output and is being measured as part of the value added. So what you could say of this first group, it's a little bit convenient the way where we are right now, because if you think about this first group of intangibles, you could actually argue that those are the ones that are sort of most directly related to technology, right? R&D, software, databases, it's directly related to the latest technologies. Whereas the second group, that's not yet in GDP, is what you might call indirectly related to technology. It's what you use in applying these new technologies and make them work in a business environment. So I would call them business innovation related, but they're not currently yet included into the national accounts. The welcome part of the, let me see if I have this here, yes. Let me first talk a little bit about these intangibles here. This is an overview of 4 types of intangibles. The blue part is the share of tangible investment as a share of GDP. So this is machinery and equipment, which is and buildings, which is the dark blue part. And then there's the light blue part, which is basically ICT hardware. So this is computers and other ICT hardware, telecom equipment, and so on. And on the right-hand side, the green stuff, you can see the technology-related intangibles, that first group in the national accounts, and the business innovation-related intangibles, okay? So good news is that overall, the investment share between the pre-financial crisis period, 1996 to 2007, and the post-financial period, 2011-2019, you can see that share is increasing. And the other good news is that the share of intangibles is growing relative to the share of tangibles. Okay? There are differences between the EU and the US. Tangibles are still much more important in the case of the EU. than there are in the case of the US, where intangible capital has already advanced much more significantly, probably one of the reasons why the United States is probably better situated at the moment to implement these new technologies, because they're already much more an intangible economy than the European Union is. We just took 9 countries here, by the way, which you can see at the bottom, on the basis of which these data are based. These data, again, are derived from the latest EU CLAMS database, which is now being produced by the Lewis team in Rome, and is including this intangibles work as well. Just for the sake of comparison, for this meeting, I added in Austria, adding in the United Kingdom. Austria is an extreme case of what's happening in the EU as a whole. It's an even more tangible economy still than the average for the European Union. But again, even in Austria, we see that intangibles are growing, particular technology-related intangibles. The dark green part are becoming more important. This tends to be an economy. It's very sort of digitized, getting more digitized. The business innovation part of the intangible is still relatively small, whereas the UK is the opposite. It's actually these business innovation intangibles that have become much more important, probably because the UK is a less manufacturing economy. It has larger business services, and these business services use a lot more business innovation type of intangibles. That's probably the explanation. So differences between countries in terms of the share of these investments into GDP. So how are we going to work this into the national accounts? Well, you've seen the right-hand part of this. We already have the technology-related intangibles in the national accounts, but the new EU CLAMS team has now added these business innovation-related intangibles as well. And that's very helpful because we now have a complete picture of this. But it does mean that our growth accounts have a slightly different slightly different output growth, because output is now also produced by business innovation intangibles. And as a result, also total factor productivity is slightly different. The good thing of the EU CLAMS is that I produce both this data set, but also produce the statistical data set, which is based on the original national accounts types of numbers. Okay, what do we see here? This is just a decomposition of labor productivity growth. Looks at the contribution of labor composition, so that's the gray stuff, that's the increases in the qualifications of the workforce, so that's the human capital part. And then you get the contribution of capital deepening, more capital per hour worked in non-IT capital, in IT capital, and then you get this contribution of these 2 intangible groups. And then the purple part is total factor productivity growth, which drops out as a residual in this type of accounting. Well, you look at this and you see, well, there's one thing very visible. First of all, labor productivity has slowed down. We already have seen that, confirmed by the numbers, and it's largely driven by total factor productivity growth. And if we look at Austria and the United Kingdom, same story, a lot more total factor productivity growth before the financial crisis, and since then it has slowed. Austria is actually doing not too bad compared to some of these other countries, but mind you, it's coming from a slightly lower level. It's had a lot of catching up to do, and therefore probably still showing somewhat better performance, although much slower than it used to be. Now, when you look at these intangibles, you say that doesn't look too bad. These intangibles are actually still quite important, and relatively, I mean, labor productivity has become less, but the share of intangibles in this story has increased. So our economies have become more intangibles driven, if you like. But we have to be a little bit careful here, because we have to, this is a growth accounting kind of ex post type of approach of decomposing this stuff. But we know from growth theory, of course, that total factor productivity has an endogenous impact on capital. So if total factor productivity goes up, it does mean that it gets more attractive for companies to make these investments. So we have to be careful that the recipe of this is not ramp up intangible investments, whatever you do, because it will drive productivity growth. It might, to some extent, but in case of total factor productivity growth, we have to make sure that it feeds back into more investment. Again, we have no time. This gets into the theory that I'm sure Philippe Aguillon has talked about 2 years ago, because he has contributed so much to this field. So be careful with these numbers. There's an endogeneity here of capital that matters, but I will not go into more detail on that here. Okay. Why has this slowed down? So again, let's go back for a minute to the measurement problems. I explained some of these measurement problems. They do play a role in the slowdown. Chad Syverson actually was in Manchester last week, gave a great talk. And this is the only note which I quote directly from him. And he said, for measurement to explain the productivity slowdown, not just productivity growth in general, but the slowdown, you need 3 things. You need a measurement problem. Well, we probably have one. You need a measurement problem that gets worse. You have to make clear that it gets worse, and it needs to happen at a particular point in time to see it's worse now than it was previously. So it's too easy to just say the measurement problems, that must be part of the problem of the productivity slowdown. No, that can only be the case if those three conditions are being fulfilled, and that's not necessarily always the case. Ian Goldin and associates have published a great paper in Journal of Economic Literature earlier this year. Highly recommended. If you want to get a good overview of all the productivity issues, then please take a look at that. And they basically said, well, yes, there's been a 1.7% slowdown in the United States in terms of productivity growth, but a small portion of that, probably around 13% of that on average, can be explained by measurement problems. There's a big margin. It could be less, could be a bit more. But the main point is this is definitely not the whole story of the slowdown. And most of it seems to be concentrated in the boundaries of output that has to do with the measurement of digital services. So are we measuring all the digital output that's ending up in your pockets and on your desks? Are we measuring that well? That's probably much more important than the measurement of inputs that we care a lot about when we do these kind of productivity type of exercises. So measurement matters, but probably part of the story. But we could perhaps say, because Goldin's article doesn't really deal with the latest wave of AI, that there is a problem there. Now, other problems, again, I already mentioned some of those earlier on in the talk, related to the aftermath of the crises that might have slowed productivity growth, and happy to discuss that when we do later. But the thing that I really want to drive is the fact that there might also be something related to the way that these technologies lately have been sort of working its way through the economy. And one element, this left-hand chart, many of you will have seen this chart, it's been going around for quite a few years, showing that the 5% most productive firms, corrected for the industries that they're in, have way outpaced the productivity performance of the remaining 95%. So we have a strong economy that has this kind of winner-takes-all effect. That happened before in technology revolutions, but it seems to be really big in the past couple of decades. There seems to be a big concentration, in fact, of these technologies in these companies, and there's a reason for that, which I'll come back to in a minute. It's not just a US story. On the right-hand side, you see multiple countries. Top line here is the 10% most productive companies, and then you can see for various countries where the 40 to 60% decile, the percentile is sitting in terms of productivity, and the 10% least productive firms. And there are very large gaps for lots of countries, although there are, of course, differences. So what it seems to suggest is that there might be a bit of a shift of the distribution of more companies sitting in the low productivity category. So this is one of the issues of the productivity slowdown and the productivity paradox. We have all this technology around, but there are fewer companies that get the productivity from it. So we see this shift to the left happening. And in the UK, we have done some work on that recently, to actually, as part of that productivity agenda that Michael referred to earlier, by basically looking at these three groups of companies in the productivity distribution and see how much did they contribute to productivity growth. So look at the top chart, the top bar here of the right-hand chart. Three parts of this. The right-hand blue part is the 10% most productive companies in the UK. The little gray part on the left is the 50% least productive companies in the UK. And then the middle orange part is the 60th to 90th percentile. Okay, and you see that the 10% most productive companies, they account for most of the productivity growth. The 10%, the 50% least, less, of course, they're less productive, so they also contribute less to growth, but it's also something that doesn't really change much over time. But then see what happened between the period before the financial crisis and since. So before the financial crisis, even though these 10% companies were really important, the 60 to 90 percentile of companies in terms of productivity levels also contributed a lot to productivity growth. And then see what happened after 2010. In the case of the UK, all the productivity slowdown is explained by the companies in the 60 to 90 percentile of the productivity distribution. So those are not the smallest, weakest companies. They don't contribute. They're important for many reasons, certainly from an inclusive and sustainable productivity growth point, but for just the productivity growth number, don't matter all that much. The 10% are as important as they were before, and perhaps even somewhat more important, certainly in some other countries than the UK. But it's that middle group, those companies that are actually more productive than the average median company, they're just not doing this anymore. So we have a diffusion problem On the one hand, we have a situation where a lot of these new technologies are locked up in these 10% most productive companies, but it also doesn't diffuse to the rest of the economy. And that's why this diffusion part that you mentioned earlier, Michael, is so important. Okay, that then gets me to the next part, artificial intelligence, and then I will begin to wrap up. Will artificial intelligence help us to change this, or will it make it worse? Now, there's been a massive amount of debate over the last 2 or 3 years about the role of artificial intelligence. Has picked up very significantly. I think it's quite useful to make a distinction between the macro literature and the firm level literature. The macro literature, this is very early on. This was produced more than a year ago by Goldman Sachs. But the nice thing of Goldman Sachs, although some of the estimates are wild, and it's all kind of an, just a projection of what might possibly happen, they did admit that there was a very wide range of potential impacts of AI on productivity growth, from between 0.3 and 2.9. The newspapers tended to quote to 1.5, so 1.5% productivity growth over a period of 10 years' time, additional productivity growth. It's not levels, it's just growth rates. So it's quite substantial, but it could only be 0.3 additional productivity growth, or it could be 2.9. And I think the other thing that's important here is that it really makes a distinction between the impacts of AI on either being displacing workers, so it's basically automation that helps us to reduce the number of workers, that's the dark blue part, or it is augmenting workers. We get new technologies in and it will make people more skilled than the people that are staying behind. And then there's also a redeployment effect, which is that some of these displaced workers do get reemployed somewhere else in the economy. And what you see, we could spend again the whole evening discussing this, but what you see is that the bigger the effect, the larger is the displacement effect, right? So basically, you can get very little results, good news in terms of it's sort of augmenting, but if you want to have the big chunk of productivity results, it's going to be displacement that's going to drive a lot of that, right? Which gets us to the question, can we do that if we want growth to be inclusive and sustainable? Do we want it? It's not only can we do it, but do we want it? Are we okay with 2.9? Or would we rather say, well, maybe 1.5 is good too, because it gets us a much more balanced picture of displacement versus enhancement. So that's where we are with the macro effects. Honestly, it's too early to say what the macro effects of this will be. It will take time, whatever happens. So it's much more interesting at this point to look at the micro firm level results. And again, there's lots of research going on. This is just latest work from the OECD that was published just a couple of weeks ago. And I think it makes a good distinction between the importance of generative AI versus non-generative AI, right? So on the left-hand side, you typically get, and these are use cases of individual firms. There are different types of studies looking at various effects, and you can see there are different methods and different definitions of AI, but all non-generative AI, which means are company-specific, quite often based on machine learning type of applications, creating a lot of sort of intangible capital, quite often within these leading companies. And you get an effect that's very typical of digital technology, about up to 10% over a period of about 10 years time. If you go to generative AI, which is the right-hand side, which is sort of the latest real big development, sort of language processing, but also foundational models that will, large language models, but also foundational models that will allow companies to really start developing new products and new services, a lot more off the shelf so that it's easier to accessible for firms. You now see use cases of effects of 20 to 50% over a period of 10 years. So that's not small, that's big. But it's only a limited number of companies so far that are really enjoying this kind of benefit. If this kind of benefit would translate itself more broadly, if it would get diffused across the economy, it will be a game changer. And it will be a big effect. And we should not exclude that possibility. But remember in the previous chart, it really depends on, it will have big implications on the displacement versus the enhancement type of effects that we're looking at. We don't quite know. This chart is interesting. I picked this up from one of the blogs by investors. So on the right-hand side, the little small picture is the productivity J-curve that I described to you before, right? So, we see we understate productivity growth early on, we overstate it later on. Part of that is a measurement problem, but as I just explained, part of that is a real problem. It just takes time for companies to do this kind of stuff. put it next to what investors like to use. That's what's called the technology hype curve, which is there's a whole bunch of technologies that are sort of coming on this curve, and there's huge expectations of what that is going to do, and you get a peak of inflated expectations, then the whole thing starts to collapse again, and then somewhere you balance it out and you get to a plateau of productivity. Put the productivity J-curve on its head, put it next to the hype curve, and you get a pretty good match. Now, of course, this is just a little illustration, but it just does show us that the hype curve does have some relationship with the productivity J-curve. If we overhype, it might be that the negative effects of productivity will take significantly longer before they're going to pay off. And this is my worry, that is that we're overhyping it way too early, frankly, because there are very few AI companies that are doing, or very few companies that do really well on AI on the financial markets. If you look back at the dot-com bubble in 2000, we had a lot more companies that were overvalued at that time than is the case right now. So there's a bit of a relationship, but again, nothing measured there, no proof of this. Okay, is this time then different with AI? Is it just a matter of time, or is there a lot of new unknowns that are happening here? So we had the measurement version of the productivity paradox. Lots going on there. We are beginning to improve to do this. And we could argue that time is going to sort this out. When we'll get better at measuring this kind of stuff, we'll see it properly reflected in the statistics. But there's a real story too, because every general purpose technology has its own issues. And I think there are three things that I would emphasize here for artificial intelligence. First of all, AI, probably more than any other digital technology, needs to be joined up with skills, software, and data, right? So this is another picture from that OECD study that I referred to earlier. And you could say that's sort of the new production function of AI, right? So the inputs here, to a large extent intangibles, skills, software, and data. That's what you need in order to make AI work. There's a little twist, because there's a big tangible as well, which is the equipment you need in order to accelerate computing power, right? Because you need a lot more computing power, and for that you need to have hardware systems that can actually do it. So it's not just an intangible story, there's a bit of a tangible story there as well. And from that you can then get outputs that are, certainly robotics, creating new physical tasks that are taking over those tasks from workers, but also better predictions, better recommendations, and better content. So that new production function was quite different from the traditional production function that we had, although there's similarities, and certainly the emphasis of this is changing quite a bit. So we have to think very hard about how do we develop that production function, how do we actually measure this. So that's the first thing. AI applications, lots of intangibles. These intangibles need to be joined up quite significantly. Secondly, that computing power that I emphasized and the need for hardware equipment that can deal with that is a big issue, because the energy usage of AI computing power is frightening. And we need to deal with this, and there is clear evidence that traditional digital systems cannot do this any longer. It will just completely collapse. We need to think about other ways. Quantum computing is a possible way forward, but it's very early days. And it's even not certain that quantum computing will be that less energy using as digital systems are. There's a lot of debate about that in the literature, actually. And then the third big thing that makes AI different from previous technologies has to do with the responsible AI, with the ethics around AI. This is a lot more tricky than a lot of the other technologies. Again, I don't have to go into details here. You all have see this in practice: safety, security, privacy issues, potential threats that this can create globally for individual businesses, and so on. This means that government is all over this because they want to do this. They want to make sure that we're not sort of letting the complete system collapse. They need to collaborate on that between countries, but certainly also with business. And quite often, if you talk to business about these kind of technologies, they say three things. They say, well, first of all, if we apply AI, we want to keep our customers safe. You better do that, because otherwise you lose your customer. Secondly, we want to keep ourselves safe, because our systems get hacked, we have a problem. And thirdly, we want to keep government at a distance. That's a sort of natural reaction for companies. Just try to keep regulation as much as possible out of the door. The last thing cannot be done. And I think companies come more and more to the realization that it cannot be done, that they need to work with government to make this work. And government needs to understand that they need to work with business to get this done. And I think this is a fundamental change in the relationship between business, government, and civil society. I'm going to wrap up. My last couple of comments are fairly short and more a bit of an introduction into the further discussion. But I want to start with the challenge that we've had ahead of us. We talked about what happened in the past. We talked about the productivity slowdown. But what is happening in front of us, which of course we don't quite know, but I'll try to take you through. And let's start with the United States. And what these charts are showing you is the growth of GDP. And the growth of GDP in various sub-periods. 2 periods are past, and 1 period is projection forward, 2033 to 2035. And it only looks at the contribution of working hours growth and labor productivity growth. Those 2 things add up by definition to GDP growth, right? You either grow more working hours or you grow the productivity per hour. Now, if you look at the United States, then hours worked growth before the global financial crisis, or just into the financial crisis, was 0.3%. In the decade, and productivity growth was very good. This was the period of the first digital wave, or the previous digital wave. It's created a lot of productivity growth in the United States. Took a while, but this is the big bucks effect, and the retail sector and everything that sort of massively increased productivity growth. In the decade between the financial crisis and the pandemic, actually labor force growth did quite well, and hours worked in the US increased very significantly, but productivity slowed, about 1/3 of what it was before. So we saw the beginnings of that second productivity paradox that I showed you in the chart earlier. Now, if we look forward, productivity is very difficult to measure. So this is just kind of a back of the envelope exercise. We do know that the growth of the workforce is going to be quite a bit slower than it was in the decade before the pandemic. And it all depends on, aging, we know what sort of is going to happen. Migration is much more difficult to predict. But, on average, and participation even more difficult, on average maybe about 0.5% growth in the US. If we grow productivity in the same way as we did in the period before the pandemic, it means that GDP growth in the US will be just above 1%, 1.2, 1.3%. If we want to achieve the same GDP growth as we did in 2011 and 2022, we have another 0.7% productivity growth. That's about 1.5, 0.8, 0.7. That's actually the trend growth the US is at right now, right? The latest labor productivity figures are about 1.5% in the US. The question is, can they keep that kind of trend? Then they might just be able to match the growth rate of the period between the financial crisis and the pandemic. That wasn't a great growth period. It was okay, but I worked in the United States at that time, and most people would say it wasn't the best period the US has seen before. If you want to go back to that good period of the 1996-2010, you would have to add another 0.5% growth, so in total, about 2.1% productivity growth. That's about as much as we did in the 1996 to 2010 period. Not impossible, but it's quite an uplift from where we currently are. Here's the euro area number. Quite a different story here. Labor force growth did actually quite well in the period 1996 to 2010, when we raised participation in the euro area. Then it slowed to 0.4%, but it will actually be negative in the period going forward, and that's because aging is kicking in much more rapidly in the case of Europe. Now, if you do the same exercise, say 0.6% productivity growth is what we had in the previous period, it means that our overall growth rate is not going to be more than about 0.6% GDP growth over the period 23 to 35. I think we would all agree that's too low. Just matching the productivity growth we had in the period before the pandemic is just not good enough. It will be way too low from what is needed for everything that we need to do. If we want to go back to the growth that we had between the financial crisis and the pandemic, we would have to add another 0.8% to offset some of these negative effects of labor force growth. And if we want to do as well as we did in the 1996-2010 period, we would have another 0.7%, which is 2.3% productivity growth. I wish Europe and the euro area a lot of good luck, but I think that's going to be quite a challenge. So we have to accept the reality that the challenge ahead of us, just to match what we've been doing in the past in terms of GDP growth, is already quite a substantial one. So why do I think that productivity growth will need to be able to focus on inclusive and more sustained growth in going forward? Well, technology can do some of this work on the productivity growth numbers that I showed you a minute ago. But it is hard to see that we can sustain such gains over a longer period of time unless we fully diffuse the effects of new technology. And that really brings me to that claim that it needs to be more inclusive and more sustainable. The first part of the curve you have seen before here, the three things on the left, but the left-hand side is trying to define what inclusive growth really is about. It's about broad-based access to all resources for productivity growth. Well, we have already seen, looking at the firm level effects, that that's not the case. We actually see a lot of firms that are not having access to the sources to become more productive. We need to have processes that makes these to turn these outcomes into a more efficient way into sustainable outcomes. Well, that's what innovation is all going to be about, and it may happen, but it will take time. And we have to distribute the gains widely across society, because if we don't, we will end up with too many of these places that get in these low-level productivity traps. In other words, you can give them a technology, but it's not going to change anything unless you give them also more skills, unless you give them also better housing and better healthcare and all those kind of things. So that's why it's important to do. I do think that we can get faster productivity growth that's not inclusive. It just will not last. And that's, I think, also one of the risks we are thinking about in the US. That's why I'm still reserved about the US. Yes, we do see faster productivity growth in the US, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has definitely contributed a lot to that. But will it really be translated into something that will stick because more communities, more societies, and more firms will benefit from it? I don't think that's been suggested yet, that's been seen yet in the case of the US. And in the case of Europe, we're just at the beginnings of all this. So it's really important that we begin to think about these kind of effects and make them more inclusive. Okay, last words, policy. Does policy help here? Yes, it does. But pro-productivity policies are extremely difficult to do. We don't have a department of productivity. We don't have a ministry of productivity. Yes, Austria has a productivity commission, so do many other European countries. But these productivity commissions, by definition, work across a lot of policy domains. This is work, I've done the same paper with Dirk Pilat that I mentioned before, where we tried to develop a little bit of a typology of what kind of policies do matter for productivity. And who's actually doing this? So some of this is about factors of accumulation, that's investment. Some of it is about markets and allocations. This is about competition. Some of it is about innovation and technological change. So that's typically an innovation policy and a science strategy and science policy. Some of it is about globalization, because productivity is about scale and it's about trade and foreign direct investment. And some of it is fundamentally about foundations around productivity policies, including macro policies, including the capabilities that government has. And bringing these kind of technology, these kind of different policies together is what is critical in order to make policy conducive to that inclusive and sustainable growth that's going to happen, because otherwise it will just be mixed. Now, these policy mixes change over time for many reasons. You know, countries live different levels of development, the technology changes, as I've just been mentioning before. There's a lot of change of thinking around the role of pro-growth and innovation and industrial policy, certainly something we can discuss a little further. And even then, we did some work on individual G20 countries. Even countries that are very comparable don't necessarily follow the same kind of pathways because they build on their own foundations, their own institutional history. That is quite important. That is quite important in this respect. So pro-productivity policies are important, but are essentially about coordinating and joining up. Productivity commissions can help, but it needs to be implemented by the policy makers to work across these various departments. And I think in many cases, if I may be a bit provocative for the discussion, I think in many cases the productivity commissions haven't yet succeeded to make the policy makers really coordinate these policies and join them up very well. But that's for discussion. My concluding slide before my very last one. How do we make productivity policies fit for purpose? Well, first of all, I think our policies need to be balanced technological progress better with the diffusion of technology. I think that point has been very well made. We need to create more absorptive capacity of firms, but also of ecosystems, because if they don't have the absorptive capacity, if they are in these low-level traps, you can give them new technologies, but it won't change anything. So finding that balance is very important. I didn't talk much about industrial policy here, but it is clear that there's a new paradigm needed if we want productivity to be inclusive or driving inclusive sustainable growth. We need more attention for investment-related policies that are related to that. And it needs this broader definition of productivity that I mentioned earlier. More resources and different types of outcomes. But we also just shouldn't forget about competition. One of the reasons a lot of this technology gets locked up in this 10% most productive companies is not just because they have the additional intangibles, but also there are barriers being thrown up that makes it hard to diffuse this. So competition policies have to be original and new in order to make sure that the diffusion process is happening. And that requires strong institutions and capabilities and an ability to learn. My last slide, how not to miss a productivity revival again. Well, clearly we must understand the past in order to be acting now and to build the future. So let me end with a quote of Shakespeare. After all, I'm from the UK, so I thought if I go somewhere else, I better do something that's coming from my country, at least the country I live in. This is from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Act number 4. And I'll just read it out, and you'll see why this is so relevant for what we're talking about today. There is a tide in the affairs of man, which, taken at a flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. Thank you.
Join me. Oh, there's even name tags. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, there are names. That's the path. There is stuff. I have to look for my place.
I don't know where.
Here it is. Okay.
So thank you, Bart. As you know, this lecture is followed by some reactions, critical or complimentary, by a group of experts. They've all worked on topics of that type. I must say, overall, I'm glad you chose from a much wider spectrum of research you're doing and work you're doing. You focused quite a bit on where you really did pioneering work which affected many other people's research, which is how to grapple in different phases where economies go through different technology experiences, how to do quantitative work, basically. As you, I think the work which I think our institute originally participated in on the digital technology, it was very important to define capital differently, digital and non-digital capital, and you showed some of this. And as you showed, you were pushing the frontier of measurement and analysis further with the analysis of intangibles and differentiating with, amongst these intangibles. And I think you can see that Bart is trying to capture current developments with the need of more quantitative possibilities of analyzing these issues. I think the other bits which I think was also quite clear in the earlier work, you focus on sectoral data, sector by sector. Now it is quite clear that to understand diffusion processes, the taking up of technologies, we have to look at companies. And I think there again there's a link to Schumpeter because he was quite interested in managerial capacities, yeah, the entrepreneurship, organizational forms. And I think, as you pointed out, the analysis of organizations, differentiation of organizations, how they adapt to technologies and so on is a very important point. There are many other areas where you contribute, which you haven't covered, and which I think the public might also be interested in your view, like the green transition, which is a very big challenge. We might discuss it. You only scratched a little bit on the role of public policy. I think it's definitely an area which we want to capture further. And of course, the global picture is also an area where you contributed a lot because the UCLEMS database was only the starting point of analyzing productivity developments across the globe, and I think analyzing competitive processes across the world, which of course encounters a very changing geopolitical and geoeconomic context in which this is developing. So let me introduce the panel to you of researchers. I start with Agnes Kügler. Two of them are partly WIFO, but also doing other things. Apart from your work at WIFO, which is in the group on innovation, technology, industry, international competition, you also, which I didn't know it exists actually, there was a new institute on supply chain intelligence, so you might tell us a little bit about that. And you're also active in the competition authority, the Austrian competition authority. So the issue of how to conduct competition policy in the context of these new innovations is very important. So in all these areas, you've been doing important work. Michael Peneder, a lot of you will be familiar with his work. He has been the grand seigneur, I guess, in WIFO on the work on industry, technology, innovation. Currently the deputy director of WIFO, as he has been also in the past. And in fact, he has contributed also to the EU CLEMS database from the Austrian perspective. We know him also that for, I think, more than 10 years, you were in charge of the competition reports on European competitiveness reports from the European Commission. And I think it really contributed a lot to understanding what is going on in terms of innovation, industrial development, structural change at the European level. From the Schumpeter side, I might mention that you produced an interesting book, Schumpeter's Venture Money. So it's quite different from your real economy analysis in the past, where you looked at the role of money, and it got the 2022 prize from the International Schumpeter Society, which is not ours, but a different one. So last but not least, my colleague, Robert Sterer at the Vienna Institute, who is its current scientific director, also covering many of the areas which I think Bart has alluded to, the issue of innovation, technology and employment, labor market effects, very much linked also the analysis of the international context in which competition takes place. He has done a lot of work on international production networks and the role of internationalization of production. He has been our main person contributing to the EU CLEMS collaboration with Groningen, and also afterwards on the international database on input-output relations across the globe, Wired, Spinton, Pronto, and many European horizon and research projects. So I didn't give any assignments to any of the panel members. I just let them react to whatever they chose, starting with Agnes, please.
Okay. So thanks for inviting me today, and thanks for the very interesting lecture part. You addressed an incredible number of different aspects in terms of productivity and productivity growth. So while I largely agree with the presented documents, I would like to make some observations which I think might be also worthy to elaborate on. And when I first saw the title of your lecture, How Not to Miss a Productivity Revival Again, I thought about the grand challenges we are facing at the moment. And well, for the last 5 to 10 years, what we've seen is a global resurgence of industrial policy measures, which is accompanied by protectionism and a war of promotion, mainly between China and the United States. And this also had some effects on the European level, of course. So induced by the industrial policy from China and the changing product portfolio, what has been produced by China over the last years, what we see is that it has an effect on firm level productivity in Europe as well. So what we've shown in a recently published paper together with Andreas Reinstahl, I think he's here today as well, he's from the Austrian Productivity Board, as well as together with a colleague of mine from WIFO, we show that the increasing share of Chinese firms, of Chinese imports in total imports, has a negative impact on the European productivity at the firm level. And this particularly took place after the financial crisis in 2008, and mainly affected were the low performance firms in the European Union. So, of course, it is in the very interest of the EU to counterfact these results and what is happening there. So, the implementation or thought about the implementation of new industrial policies is, well, rather close. However, the implementation of these policy measures is also accompanied by a number of challenges that make me personally a bit skeptical about these developments. So, as was also mentioned by you, Bart, it is very important to direct resources towards those firms and those sectors which are probably the most productive ones and promise the most productivity gains in the future. However, what is often forgotten by policymakers, at least I believe, is the risk that not only the very productive firms might be affected by these policy measures, but also the non-competitive firms who would have exited the market otherwise without any subsidies. And this in turn would lead to a negative effect on aggregate and sectoral productivity levels in the European Union, and would also lead to negative effect of consumers in the end of the European Union. So, to a certain degree, we know from the literature that business dynamism is a driving factor of productivity growth. And we know that in Austria, but also in other European countries, the turnover rate, that is the number of exits and entries in the market, is rather low, and it's lower than in China, even lower than in the United States, which is a problem. However, when we introduce policies which makes it easier for non-competitive firms to stay in the market instead of just exiting, so who increases the probability of their survival, although they shouldn't, this is just not what we want to see, right? This is a counterfacting measure in the end. So we shouldn't focus on strengthening existing well-established firms which are there, but it might be more reasonable or more promising to focus on improving human capital. So in the end, an increase or an enhancement of human capital might also help us solve the problem which was mentioned before of diffusion of technology. Of course, we all know about the role of STEM education, and that is important, but what is also important is to improve intermediate skills. So the value of the composition of the workforce is really high, and it shouldn't be neglected what role this plays for productivity growth. It's even getting more and more important when thinking about the demographic change. So what we face in Austria, but also other European countries, is an aging workforce. And we know from the literature that aging workforce is connected to less dynamism in businesses, less or little innovation, which in turn reduces productivity growth. So what is really important is to think about enhancing the skill levels, lifelong learning, and to make it possible for workers to participate longer in the workforce and stay productive as long as it might be.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this meeting. As you mentioned, I also know Bart for a long period. You mentioned the EUCLIMS project, but even before EUCLIMS, there was a EPKI project where we first met. And yeah, in the introduction, you all praised his Bart's scholarship. I want to add my special admiration or the real quality that I always think stuck out is the kind of science entrepreneurship that I noticed with him. So getting funded for big and important novel projects, and then managing the big international networks and getting people the work done that they in the end delivered. That was a big thing to experience together with you in some of also what had been formative years for myself. So for coming to the lectures, this is a Schumpeter lecture, and upon invitation of the Schumpeter Gesellschaft, I want to give somewhat a bridge also to Schumpeter. What immediately comes to my mind that I always try to remind people is that Schumpeter never was interested in growth per se. He always emphasized that his interest is in economic development, and he defined that economic development deliberately and very forcefully as something that always comes from the combination of both growth and qualitative changes of the system. And this is what now we talk about big transformations, digital transformation, green transformation. This is the kind of big changes that we have to understand as economic development, I think. And that's why this kind of conception of how the economy works and how it can contribute is still highly relevant. And you often made a point. So Schumpeter, in fact, was thinking very much beyond GDP. That's not an entirely novel attitude. Now, if we speak about qualitative transformations, then this already implies that these do not come in steady processes. So that's the kind of punctuated events that might be with some academic or intellectual imagination, one can project them into waves. Certainly they are not steady, they are irregular, and with this occurrence of big breakthroughs that carry along the potential for a lot of incremental follow-up innovations and the whole distribution process that follows, then you get something like wave-like developments that maybe are most visible as waves, not so much in terms of productivity numbers, I guess, but the kind of data that Bart did show in let's say, where in the financial markets where you have the sentiments and expectations in there, and the over-optimism and then the depression that brings in this kind of regularity in the movements. I don't think that pure productivity numbers would ever produce such smooth patterns, but there's something behind it that goes along with it. And that, of course, the waves was a big Schumpeterian theme. It is kind of the preferred explanation of techno-optimists, like Schumpeter was. I think of Bart, as I know him also, as more of a techno-optimist. Of course, there are also other explanations for this productivity slowdown that would be more pessimistic. The one issue which you did not touch upon, but which is also prominent in the literature, is about saturation. Could it be that we somehow run out of opportunities for productivity growth? Is at some point our wants and needs satisfied in a way that it's not really leaving so much new to discover? Again, Schumpeter was very clear on that point. Also at his time, this was an issue that was discussed, and he made two important points, I think, in that regard. The one argument of his was that history tells us that such periods of saturation are only temporary. So this was his optimistic view that the entrepreneurial spirit and drive will always find new latent wants and needs that even people are not yet aware themselves, but they will find those needs, and these create again the new needs and the new opportunities for growth. On the same page, Schumpeter also said that on a logical ground one can never say for sure, because this is only in retrospect, looking at history. This is what history tells. But logically, one can never preclude the possibility in the case that maybe indeed we run out. So there could be something, as a hypothetical construct, there could be something like an absolute limit to productivity growth somewhere. And maybe we smoothly approach it and achieve lower growth rates in productivity. And theories like by Robert Gordon could be of that kind, that even if we have a lot of new technology around that is apparent, maybe that new technology doesn't provide that much new value in terms of increased living standards, increased of actual value to our life satisfaction. And this could be something like that. So it's just to remind us it's a hypothetical possibility. But if you think about the likely consequences, if such a hypothetical possibility would indeed be the case, then I think at least of two possible implications. One would be that in the trade-off between working hours and leisure time, people would voluntarily try to work less hours and try to consume more leisure time. And that's something, at least in Austria, is a big topic now, because that's something we observe in the data, whether it's for this or for other reasons, but it is something that would fit this kind of what one could expect if one thinks along this term. Second implication, of course, would be that this would not affect world productivity growth rates, as we have very different levels of productivity. This would rather mean that growth potential and the growth rates must shift from the global north. If, let's say, they would come closer to the saturation level, then these growth rates would shift towards the global south. It still has a lot to catch up and try to achieve similar levels. Again, that's an issue time will tell. I just wanted to mention the idea and I wanted to mention it because this was also topics that already Schumpeter had to discuss at his time. These are recurring themes and not unique to our time. The other explanation, so this was a kind of pessimistic explanation of the productivity slowdown. Again, the optimistic explanation is the measurement errors, and I also agree. I think they must be there. Every logical reason would tell us that this big part of intangible components, this big difference in digitalization, artificial intelligence, must have major impacts on measurement. I think currently it could mainly be in terms of underestimating productivity growth. In principle, it could also result in some sort of overestimation of productivity growth at some point. And why is that the case? So if measurement problems are the reason for slowing productivity growth, then the reason is that our national accounts, we measure economic activity at transaction prices, or we construct substitutes for transaction prices. And if transaction prices on competitive markets come somewhat close to marginal costs, then we have this digital technological change where you have this very low marginal cost scalability of everything that can be programmed. And if that, in a competitive environment, drives down transaction prices, and still reservation prices is what indicates quality or utility and welfare and well-being, then this difference must increase due to that change in technology and change in the basic economic structure. That's a good reason to explain underestimation of productivity growth. Now, if we think of something different, if we think about artificial intelligence, not only in terms of its own marginal cost, but about a tool for companies to better price their products on the markets. And we have this issue of using algorithms to better find out what are the reservation prices of consumers. This could also lead to an artificial increase in the measurement, insofar if it succeeds in companies using artificial intelligence to get closer to the consumer's reservation price, and this is what then is pictured in the national accounts in the transaction prices. So there could also be, maybe not yet, but something that comes in the future, a source of overestimation. I leave it with one final remark, and that's we are currently finishing a working paper on, and you also mentioned this issue of business dynamism, a working paper on industry concentration, firm level markups, and business dynamism based on the Austrian microdata from the Austrian Microdata Center. It's a work in cooperation with the OECD multi-broad project. And I just wanted to mention, because they're relevant in this context, for Austria, this will come up maybe in the next 2 or 3 weeks. When we study industry concentration levels, they seem to be relatively flat over a period from 2008 to 2013, which we looked at. Also, we have a more or less comforting result in terms of reallocation. This what actually means Schumpeterian creative destruction, which is competition seems still to work, or seems to work, in terms of relocating production and employment towards the most productive firms. That's something that the data show well. But then there's also a third result, and that comes to my mind with the final slides that you did show with the shift in the productivity distribution. We also find in the data, and I think that's the first time that we have this evidence for Austria, that we have, with 1,000 caveats explained in the paper and with a lot of heterogeneity between different industries, but we have on average a certain tendency of increasing firm level markups. So this is an indication of lesser competition. Could be an indication of better pricing policies, whatever. And we also have this indication that the markups increase mainly in those percentiles of companies that already have the highest markups. So this discrepancy is there in the data, at least in the whole area of non-financial market services. It is not the case in manufacturing, which then is another story.
Thank you, Michael. Robert. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Also, thank you for having me here, and also glad to having been part of the UCLAIMS team at 20 years ago or something, where we collected all the data for Eastern European countries for this project. Meaning, it would be already difficult enough to speak after Bart on his comprehensive presentation. It's even more difficult to find some new points in addition to the other panelists. But let me think about a few points to raise on top of what was said here. First, on the cycle part. Meaning, I think we have seen these cycles that productivity growth is high in the 60s, then going down, going up, and now going down. I looked a bit differently on this, and I think the interesting point or the challenging point is, if you look from the troughs to the peaks, it was a period of growing productivity growth from 56 to 66, so 10 years. It was then going down from 66 to 82, about 16 years. It was then going up 82 to 88, 6 years. It was going down 88 to 96, 8 years. Going up again 96 to 04, 8 years. And then basically since then we're going down or leveling out. So this more than 20 years we're now going down or leveling out this. And this is kind of new pattern which we haven't seen from the patterns in the 50s. And I think this is what we need to explain as being at the paradox or being at the puzzle or whatever you call it in a sense, right? So what could explain this? Meaning we would expect basically that now artificial intelligence is the one technology which could kick in. We might see that we're still in this hype phase of this, and it does not really, kick in as the productivity booster. And frankly, I'm skeptical that it will kick in over the next years, because as you showed in the one slide, it's very specific to specific industries and specific tasks to be fulfilled, rather than what might be a general purpose technology to really kick in over all sectors, industries in relatively quick time. I will give some numbers to this at the end. So is this time different from the other peaks and troughs? I think yes. You've already talked about the demographics thing. Well, we did also some studies on whether demographic aging, demographic decline has an impact on picking up new technologies, and we find basically insignificant or negative effects. So this is an issue for European economies in Europe as a whole, as we have this demographic decline and aging. Second one is the climate change, which I will come back later. And the third one is contributing to this, what you might call secular stagnation, as Larry Summers did, is this deglobalization issues. And what you did not mention too much is the dependency, what you talked about, on innovation and new technologies, ICT, Europe has from China. So we import a lot of these new technologies, and here the industrial policies kick in, basically on this issue of strategic autonomy to really regain competitiveness in these new technologies, which would be the drivers of productivity over the next years then, rather than importing them. Right? So this role of innovation, what does innovation policy mean if we import a lot of these new technologies? And this is, I think, one aspect which has to be taken into account into this productivity revisal debate. well, we could talk ages on measurement issues. I think there are 2 points which I would underpin here. We talked a lot about properly measuring the inputs, say how to properly measure capital services, labor services, with all the caveats behind. Well, we can talk about how to measure intangibles. What I think is, well, basically what this would mean, the better we measure this stuff, the lower would be total factor productivity by definition. Because labor productivity is a given, so the lower would be total factor productivity. So what I think, and here I underpin completely what this Golden is in this paper is arguing, do we really properly measure the output side? Do we really properly measure GDP growth in terms of quality, in terms of intangibles and so on and so forth, right? So about 30% of the output is tangible output, like goods and agricultural products or construction services. About 70% of services, 30% of these are public services, right? So do we really properly measure this sort of the output in a decent way, as we have put a lot of emphasis on the input side? And this, I think, is one issue on the measurement issue. The second one, as you also mentioned, that we have a lot of inputs. Amongst them is the natural capital. And now in phase of environmental degradation, it's basically how we properly measure this, well, basically you can call it depreciation or destruction of the natural capital. I think this has to be taken very much into account when it comes also to beyond GDP measures and on all this stuff also. So these are just 2 points on the measurement issue. Well, finally, third point quickly on these large versus small firms. Meaning the question for me is then, if these productivity gains are really just to the larger firms, do we see what Schumpeter called this creative destruction, which goes basically much to the smaller firms? By definition, it would be, because this would be outpaced in a competitive manner. Underpinning this, we also worked a bit on this Austrian microdata and looked at, well, just to mention one study, we looked at this survey on the use of new technologies and ICT capital by firms. And just a few basic findings. First of all, how difficult it is to measure ICT or ICT inputs. So you have robots, you have 3D printing, you have use of ERP software, EDI software. So it's a lot of very different tiny bits which has to be measured properly when it comes to output. So this Digital Economies Society Index, the DESI, which is used at the European Commission, uses 33 indicators reflecting ICT inputs or ICT outputs to measure the digital capital properly in a way, right? So what this survey says, just a few numbers, and this underpins that the diffusion of these sort of technologies might be very limited or very slow. So for example, in this survey, about 10% of the companies state that they use industrial robots, 4% state they use service robots over a period from 2015 to 2022. So, around 7% use 3D printing. Of course, this might be a small sample, but it's very low numbers. 10% states they use artificial intelligence, whatever they understand as artificial intelligence, as text mining, transformation of spoken into written words and so on. But this, again, I think as you underpinned as well in your talk, on very specific tasks in specific firms in a way. And finally, so I could go over these numbers. What is the headline of this is basically, if firms use these new technologies, these are much bigger firms and much more productive firms. And I think the causality runs from big and productive to using these technologies rather than vice versa, so we have not tested it econometrically. Final point, in this survey, about 75% of the firms argue that they have difficulties in finding ICT personnel. So I think this is one of the key aspects then, that the ICT personnel has to be trained and has to be enhanced in the society, which is one leeway to increase the take-up of the new technologies in a way. And just one final number on that. We looked also at this DESI index, and for example, in Finland, which is the leader in this index, about 40% of the companies argue or say that they provide training, ICT training to their own personnel. In Europe, it's about 25%, 23%. In Austria, it's 20%. So I think it's not only the public services which has to provide this training, it's also the firms which has to take up to train their staff to become leaders in these technologies, like, say, the leading country in this sense, the Finland is doing. I stop here for...
Thank you, Robert. I think since we're late, I won't come back to you immediately. I'll take some comments or questions from the audience here. Daniel and Karl and on this and Josef. Okay.
I may have a macroeconomic bias, but the discussion focuses clearly on productivity dynamics and gains. But what we see is that the euro area traditionally has been running a current account surplus, and a big one. One could say the macroeconomic policy was not adequate, and this is why, and so on and so on. But this is a reality. And what I think, going along this line of reasoning, is that what matters are not productivity gains per se, but relative productivity gains. I mean, this is what matters in the end. You may have productivity gains, but if another economy has much larger productivity gains, then everything can become messy. I mean, this is a real issue. And what I haven't seen in your matrix of drivers of productivity gains and so on, political capital. You could say, yes, it's institutional capital. No, political capital, because we may have to re-engineer so-called democratic capitalism to have diffusion of productivity gains and so on, how to fight the large companies. I mean, it's with our antitrust policies, although in Europe one could argue, why should we fight? I mean, it's our large companies. How can we fight American companies if we want to destroy the European large companies? So these are issues which I have not seen in your presentation. It has seemed to me to be very micro-oriented.
Just pass the microphone in front of you. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to come back to the issue of the link between productivity and productivity growth to the openness of markets. Some of you have alluded to that we are probably in for a period of deglobalization, more protectionism, trade barriers, you name it. Now, traditional wisdom has it that this should have a cost in terms of productivity growth. And my question to the panel is, I mean, first, would you share, this story and say, okay, traditional wisdom still holds, or are there reasons, to be optimistic that it could be different this time? But if not, would you be willing to put a figure on possible productivity costs that we may see in, say, foreseeable future stemming from that fact?
Thank you. Josef, on the other side? Yeah.
You mentioned in the broad picture that we have the output side, and that the output side has to be broadened. Well-being, welfare, all these words. But in the productivity measurement, I didn't see them nowhere. So it's a bit related to the Sterra intervention. And also maybe to the saturation remark. If you talk to people out there, and you started by saying not everybody knows what productivity is. I would say many people doubt why productivity and productivity growth is so important for economists. And maybe it's not so much saturation, but many people have the feelings, in particular also young people, as you can infer from surveys, that we produce so much nonsense. It's not that I say we don't have problems to solve. To the contrary. But we don't solve the true problems by our economic inputs, by economic growth. We produce damage, we produce waste, all kinds of things. We produce stealing, cheating, manipulation by artificial intelligence or digital new technologies. So I think, how would you answer to these skeptics outside our profession?
It's another research agenda to measure negative output, no? Over there in the back.
Thank you. Professor van Ark, it struck me that you showed the large companies gaining on productivity versus the others, the laggards. Yet we live in the information age, right? You would argue that diffusion of technology should become easier, faster. We have very robust competition laws. We have exchange, we have open markets. So what's your hypothesis? Why are these larger firms gaining on the other ones? And what are the specific diffusion barriers and what can we do about them?
Probably one last comment from...
It's very short. Regulation. Actually, one of the reasons I came was to listen to some comments about the tsunami of regulatory fury, which is becoming larger and larger. Take the AI, take the deglobalization. This is very strongly driven by over-regulation. It perhaps explains why the larger companies are more able to show productivity gains than the smaller ones, because they just cannot cope with the regulations.
Thank you. I think, Bart, you have a large menu, yeah?
Yes. Yes, and I'm not sure where to start. I'll try to pull a few things together rather than be trying to directly answer all the questions. I mean, they're really important points to make and really sort of show the challenge that we're having. I think, first of all, there's pretty strong consensus that, you know, we do have a competition problem, that we do have a locking up of these resources in larger companies reflected in higher markups and so on. The point that was just made very forcefully by the speaker, the questioner just over there, is why is this? Because, you know, we do have competition laws that would allow us to do this, but somehow we don't. And this is really something that I think we need to get our arms around, because it does show that apparently our current competition law is not very conducive to the regulation. What I try to make clear in my talk is that a lot of these inputs that are required to make these new technologies work are complementary. So you can't just do the technology, you have to do a lot of other things, and to do that, larger companies are usually better equipped to bring all these resources together. There's a lot of scale effect here as well. There is an element of failure that needs to be happening. Larger companies can afford a lot more failure, although sometimes it blows up, but most of the time it's contained before we even know about this. Smaller companies cannot do this. So I think a big issue with AI technology is the joining up of different inputs. Skills, very important point you made earlier, intermediate skills. It's, by the way, not just IT skills. One of the key issues of the latest sort of digital technologies, it needs a lot of software skills, negotiation skills, coordination skills, conflict skills, and all those kind of things, which you don't necessarily get at school, but you get in companies, which is a point that you made earlier. So doing that is difficult, and larger companies have an advantage of being able to do this themselves, whereas smaller companies and even medium-sized companies need more help in this respect from accessing resources, to join resources, to access government models that are providing them those kind of things as well. So I do think that we really have to rethink the way that competition law is being integrated with other critical elements of pro-productivity policies, which is really what my last point was driving to, that it needs to be really joined up significantly better. If you look in the UK, for example, to the work that the current competition authority is doing, they actually take on an increasing amount of other things that are more labor market policies, that are not just product market or capital market policies. And innovation policies are a very important characteristic as well. So I think that element, I think, is important. I was very interested in the saturation point. It's true that I did not spend a lot of attention to this. Do we accept the fact that we're just in a slower growth environment because we have more and more wealthy economies? It goes back to some extent to the Baumol effect, which I actually have talked about extensively in other studies. That, you know, as the economy becomes more services oriented, we're just dealing with a lot more industries that will find it very difficult to avoid the cost disease model because they can't increase productivity as fast as the cost side is going to go up. And we definitely see that in the larger of the public sector and public services in this respect. This is true, and it may be one reason. Actually, it's one reason why I said I don't think we can go back to the high productivity growth rates that we've been seeing, you know, in the 1950s or 60s, or even in the 1980s and 90s. But I think we can definitely do better than we do now. And I do think that new technologies, that's why I'm a techno-optimist, can actually have lots of applications in the public sector and services and so on. Yes, manufacturing can do this much more quickly because you get a much more immediate effect of an investment in technology through capital, through tangible capital on your productivity growth performance. In public sectors and in services, this is much more difficult to do. So maybe there's a leveling off, but not necessarily saturation. And I think we can get to a productivity growth rate that I think is still quite an acceptable productivity growth rate to at least get back to growth rates that are quick enough for us to deal with some of the key challenges that we're having ahead of us. I accept a point on political capital, and maybe I didn't make it so explicit in what I was trying to say, but if you go to my pro-productivity policies framework and my argument that these policies need to drive inclusive, sustainable growth, there's a hell of a political challenge here. And we can call this capital, that's fine. We also can just call it that we need to be collaborative in this respect, because policymakers and businesses and across countries, in order to make this possible, because I think without that, I think it's very unlikely that we will get the results. Robert, I do accept your point that the slowdown has been very long now. Although within that slowdown period, we have seen a couple of sub-waves of digital technology that have given us the increases and then the slowdown again, because there were these headwinds that were mentioned earlier that I also mentioned: aging, demographics more generally, the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which we cannot exaggerate how important that aftermath has been. Low interest rates that were so low that we're actually misallocating resources massively. And I think we're still paying a big price for that. And then, of course, not to forget the pandemic. So I think it's very hard at the moment that we are in this secular stagnation. I've used that terminology before, but I think in the last few years with AI coming up, I'm not so sure we can keep that hypothesis there. I think there's something really there, but I think more than in previous technologies, there's a big risk that we're going to mess it up and make it a lot more difficult to do. I think I'm going to stop there for a moment. Michael, I leave it to you to wrap up. And if there's anything you say, something really important was said there, and you have to respond to it, I'm willing to try. But
well, I think probably what this event shows is there are lots of loose ends,
yes,
which is good for us because there's more work to be done. Let me just think about 3 or 4 points, which I said, picking up what was, I think it's right. I think the presentation was sort of not putting the interaction between macro contexts and macro policies and industrial economics and innovation policy together. Yeah? And I think to understand what's going on since 2000 without understanding the macro context and also the different experiences, let's say in the US or Europe or other parts of the world, probably needs an analysis of the interaction between the macro and let's say the meso and micro aspect. The other thing which we haven't really touched upon properly was the deglobalization issue and what impact that has on the overall dynamics here. Another point which we covered to some extent quite a lot was the issue of what sort of competitive structure would be optimal. And probably that is changing in the dynamics of innovation and technology. And I think we might deviate from Schumpeter in that respect, because he was, in a sense, a friend of imperfect competition. Yeah? Innovation required differential profits, basically, yeah? Differentiation of the entrepreneur and the innovator from the others. Yeah? And I think probably he opened up the ideas to at what point should you have some, what is the optimal point of a strong emphasis of diffusion here? Because if you do it too early, you won't have the massed resources at the point of trying something new, yeah, and taking on the uncertainty. Probably there's a lot of literature after that to deal with that issue. But anyway, I'm not an expert on the competition policy, but the competition policy makers don't have an easy job
No.
yeah, to find the fine line, what to do. And it's obviously a dynamic animal. Yeah? And the last point I want to bring up is these negative aspects, which you mentioned at the very beginning, yeah? That the perception of the public very often is very different from us as economists. Yeah? And I think Josef Falkinger also pointed to that. It's partly to do also with the measurement issue, what is a negative and positive outcome of technology. But I think there is something which we economists have very often not put sufficient emphasis, that innovation, change, structural change, is seen by us as a very important dynamic element of how economies are developing here. But by the general public, change is perceived as a threat in a sense, yeah? And of course, linked to that are very strong distributional implications here of gainers and losers. And how we deal with that aspect of perception and experiences of different groups, of different regions and so on. And the political outcome, which we see is extremely important currently of these negatively perceived and experienced aspects of change, I don't think we have, as economists, taken seriously enough. Yeah? And of course, that has a lot of policy implications. And I think probably the last point I want to make is these areas which you cover in your report quite a lot, is that there is a natural tendency of agglomeration. Yeah? Whenever there is an innovation boost, and it adds to the skill issue, yeah? Because the most skilled, the most innovative, the best paid, in a sense, agglomerate. Yeah? We see that in probably Britain in the most extreme case, yeah, with the South East London and so on. But I think it's almost a natural outcome of a boost of innovation to have these accentuated agglomeration phenomena. And how we judge that, again, is difficult, because probably it could be that the gap between the top 10 most productive firms and the other ones is a natural or a necessary phase in which a very big jump in new technology is taking place. Yeah? So how we judge the differentiation process is not a trivial issue. Yeah? Probably these would be my summary points for further work. I don't know if you want to add something. Yeah.
I just want to point. I want to respond to the question on regulation. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that. It's a good question, because I hear it all the time when I speak to business leaders. Too much regulation. First of all, a lot of research shows some regulation is bad, some regulation is good. So we can't sort of generalize around regulation. I think what a lot of sentiment is, there's a lot of regulation coming right now, and it feels a lot of things we need to comply with. On the one hand, because of these big transformational changes, and I made a very specific comment with AI, the regulators will be all over it. And in a way, we should be okay with that, because we need to regulate some of this. I think what is very important is again, explaining why we regulate, be very critical of the reasons for regulation, involve the business community, not just the large firms into this. It's one of the competition problems, that the large firms have a big voice, the smaller don't, in order to make this happen. So it's unavoidable in these large transformational changes that we're looking at, that regulation is going to be very important. Some of it we will need, but I think it's very important that we really understand what we're trying to do, that we experiment with it, that we're willing to accept that some regulation is bad and some is good, and we need to measure these effects very well, which is, again, is another big challenge for competition policy. Last point I want to make is on business dynamism, because you made that point before. We have to look very carefully at the statistics, because some of the latest statistics do actually suggest that some of the business dynamism is actually improving in the last couple of years. Again, I quoted earlier Chet Syverson's talk last week in Manchester, and he showed us some numbers showing that, for example, average hires and separation rates in the US have been going up quite significantly, that business formations in the UK in the last couple of years, post-pandemic, relative to what happened to the pre-pandemic period, has been going up, that high propensity business formations have been going up as well. So let's be careful that we don't get stuck in the old story, because this technology is moving quickly, and it will have, so this is my techno-optimism which I'm going to close with, it will have impact. I'm pretty sure it will. The question is how much, and whether it will make a sustained difference on the macroeconomic point well taken, that connection between micro and macro needs to be better made.
So thank you very much. I think I'm afraid we'll have to close now, but we'll have possibility of discussing outside with drinks and some refreshments outside, thanks to our hosts. Thank you very much for coming. I hope there's a lot of additional richness of thinking about it and discussing about the issues. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Danke, Dr.